I've got lots of worries about the European arrest warrant, of course. The main and most significant thing wrong with it, its fundamental flaw, is that the court considering extradition, and of course I'm interested in English courts and Scottish courts more than anything, is that the court no longer has the right to look at the prima facie evidence against the accused person and decide if there's a proper case to answer. The European arrest warrant means that extradition, which is now officially called judicial surrender, has actually been reduced to nothing more than a bureaucratic formality. Provided the piece of paper has been filled in correctly with the name, address of the person and the allegation against them, then they will be extradited. And even in the face of an obvious gross injustice, an English court now has no power to protect the rights of the accused person. And this is a complete abdication and surrender of the traditional role of an English court, which is not just to convict a guilty person, but to protect the rights of an innocent person. Now, I don't want to protect genuine criminals from investigation and from trial. That's not the point. My objection is based on the fact that the British court, Scottish or English, now no longer has the power to look at that prima facie evidence and decide if there's a proper case to answer. And what we're seeing is more and more injustices being perpetrated in the name of the European arrest warrant. The number of European arrest warrants is increasing dramatically, and I think the latest figure that there's about 14,000 across Europe. We've seen many cases in the UK where these are for fairly trivial offences, like people stealing bikes in Poland or whatever. And of course a lot of these, about 90%, are a nation trying to extradite one of its own citizens back to its own country. And as I said, many of them are for trivial offences, it would seem. But of course about 10% of these are, in my country's case anyway, British citizens being extradited. And I think there is a growth in this. And when it came out, of course, we were told that it was about for serious organised crime and terrorist offences. And we haven't seen that at all. We've seen it against, as I say, what might be considered fairly minor crimes by some people, although in my view no crime is minor if you're the victim of it. That's not the point. I think that argument is a bit of a red herring in actual fact, because all crimes are serious to the person that's being extradited, and of course whether it's a trivial crime or a very major crime like a murder, you are going to be sent off into a foreign judicial system and you could languish there for months or years awaiting trial. What people don't realise, I think, is that the continental system of justice is quite different from the Anglo-Saxon system. Our system of law was developed under common law over centuries, and it was exported to countries like America, Australia and Canada, etc. It requires somebody to be arrested after the investigation has been done by the police and charges laid in a court, and then they're remanded in custody or on bail, and a trial should ensue relatively quickly after that. Under the continental system, an investigating magistrate can require somebody to be held in prison sometimes and for very long periods, while the same investigative magistrate actually investigates the crime. So that at the end of 6 months or a year, they could come back and say, well, there's no case to answer, you're free to go. But in the meantime, somebody's had their life destroyed by this. And in my view, if a British subject is going to be extradited by a British court to a foreign judicial system, it ought to be very sure that there is a great deal of evidence that stacks up and holds water against that person, and the assurance that they're actually going to get a fair trial speedily as possible in the country that they're being extradited to. And I think all those rules are now being broken under the European arrest warrant. When the European arrest warrant first appeared in January 2004, I wrote a short pamphlet on it shortly afterwards, and one of the things I warned against is that it potentially could be used against political dissidents. Now that might seem a bit far-fetched at the time, but not now so, I think, in the light of the Julian Assange case. Now, as a politician, I don't take a view on people's guilt or innocence, that's for the courts. But then that's entirely what I'm saying. The British courts have established that there is a proper case to answer before it extradites anybody. In the Julian Assange case, this is much more complicated, because we know that the Americans want to extradite him. There's some people in America have said that he should be killed, or if found guilty of some crime, locked up for the rest of his life. And what's he accused of in America? Well, they haven't actually formulated a charge against him yet, but he's being extradited to Sweden on sexual assault charges. Now, learned legal opinion in Britain has been arrived at, which says that the things he's accused of in Sweden wouldn't actually constitute a sexual offence under English law in any case. So an English court should have the power to look at that, decide whether it believes there's a proper case to answer, and I think also take into consideration the wider political aspect of this, which is that is there a political angle? Is he being extradited to Sweden so that he can be kept in a cell, so that when the Americans decide whether they've got a charge they can lay against him or not, that he can be more easily extradited from Sweden? And Sweden has a very close relationship with the United States of America. So I think this case does give some very worrying, ask some very, very worrying and pertinent questions about the misuse of the European arrest warrant in the case of Mr. Assange. And I think the indications very strongly are that there is a political element in play with this case, which is all the more reason why the English court, which is actually meeting today as I speak, should be able to look at the evidence against him, decide whether there's a proper case to answer, and decide whether it's appropriate to extradite him or not. But of course, we all know that they won't be allowed to do that. Provided the paperwork's been filled out correctly, then I think they will come to the inevitable conclusion that they have to extradite Mr. Assange.